The backstage hallway smelled like cigarette smoke and hairspray. It was the kind of narrow corridor you find in every old American theater. Walls painted a dull cream color, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, the distant hum of a crowd settling into their seats. It was 1964, somewhere in the middle of a Motown review tour stop, and the air backstage had that particular electric charge you only get when too many massive talents are crammed into too small a space. Tina Turner was already warmed up. Anyone who had ever seen Ike and Tina Turner perform knew exactly what that meant. She had been moving, sweating, running her voice up and down scales since before most of the other artists had even arrived at the venue. She treated every stage like it was Madison Square Garden and every audience like it was the last one she'd ever performed for. That wasn't ambition. That was just how Tina was built. The stage wasn't a place she went to work. It was the only place she felt fully alive. So when someone mentioned that Marvin Gaye was closing the first half of the show that night, Tina's reaction was honest in the way only truly confident people allow themselves to be. She didn't say it with cruelty. She said it the way you'd comment on the weather. Observational, almost casual. Something along the lines of, Marvin is talented, but he doesn't know how to own a stage. He's a studio singer. Beautiful voice, wrong instincts. The kind of assessment that isn't really an insult so much as a verdict, delivered without malice, which almost made it worse. The person she said it to nodded. Nobody argued, because on paper she wasn't wrong. Marvin Gaye in 1964 was a different creature than the icon people would later come to worship. He was 25 years old, already charming, already gorgeous, with a voice that could make a room go completely still. But his relationship with performing live was complicated in ways that didn't make for easy conversation. He was shy in a way that didn't make sense for someone who looked the way he did and sang the way he sang. He preferred the studio, preferred the control of headphones and isolation booths, and the ability to do another take if the first one didn't feel right. Live performance gave him none of that. Live performance demanded something rawer, something more exposed, and Marvin wasn't always sure he wanted to be that exposed. Berry Gordy had been pushing him toward a more dynamic stage presence for over a year. The Motown machine ran on performance. These review tours were how you built a fan base that went beyond record buyers. You had to make people feel like they'd seen something they'd never forget, something they'd drag their friends to the next time you came through town. Other Motown acts understood this instinctively. The Temptations had their choreography locked down to the inch. Smokey Robinson could work a crowd with a single raised eyebrow. Martha Reeves came out swinging every single night. Marvin kept getting feedback that he was holding back, that there was a wall between him and the audience that shouldn't be there, that the voice was transcendent, but the presence was too careful, too contained. And the frustrating part, the part that made people like Gordy want to shake him, was that everyone could feel there was something enormous living inside Marvin Gaye. You could hear it in the records. You could almost touch it when he was standing right in front of you. But getting it to come out on a stage, in real time, in front of strangers, that was the problem nobody had solved yet. Tina Turner had solved that problem before she was old enough to drive, which is exactly why her comment landed the way it did. Marvin heard about it. Of course he did. Backstage on a Motown tour was not a place where things stayed private for long. He didn't react with anger. He didn't go find Tina and confront her. He didn't say anything to anyone about it, not that night, not that anyone could remember. He just went quiet in the particular way that Marvin went quiet when something had gotten under his skin. The people who knew him recognized that silence. It wasn't hurt. It wasn't defeat. It was something more like compression, like a man pulling something inward, pressing it down, letting it build pressure. He spent the hour before showtime alone in his dressing room. One of the backing musicians knocked on his door to run through a quick arrangement question and said later that Marvin seemed perfectly calm, almost unnervingly calm. He was sitting in front of the mirror, but he wasn't looking at his reflection. He was looking at something else entirely, something that wasn't in the room. The musician left quickly, sensing that whatever was happening in that dressing room wasn't meant to be interrupted. The crowd that night was restless in the way Midwest crowds sometimes get. Loud, full of energy, not yet settled on what they wanted from the evening. The earlier acts had been well received. People were having a good time, but having a good time and being genuinely moved are two completely different things, and this crowd hadn't been moved yet. There was a ceiling on the night, and everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. Marvin walked out to polite applause. He was wearing a dark suit that fit him perfectly. He took the microphone from the stand and for a moment just stood there. Not awkwardly. There was nothing awkward about it. He just stood there like someone who had decided they weren't in any hurry. A few people near the back kept talking. Someone laughed at something that had nothing to do with the stage. Marvin didn't try to compete with it. The band started the intro, and Marvin still didn't move much. He held the microphone at his side, looked out at the first few rows, and then something shifted in his posture. It was subtle enough that most people in the room probably couldn't have identified exactly what changed, but something did, like a door opening somewhere deep inside him. When he started to sing, the first note hit the room like a physical thing. Not loud. That's the part people always get wrong when they try to describe what great singers do with silence and space. It wasn't that Marvin overwhelmed the room. It was that he filled it, every corner of it, with something that felt intensely personal, like he was singing specifically to each person at the same time. The restlessness in the crowd didn't disappear all at once. It dissolved slowly, the way tension leaves a room when someone finally says the thing everyone was afraid to say. People stopped talking to the person next to them. People stopped checking the program. People stopped doing everything except listening. Tina Turner was standing in the wings on the left side of the stage. She had been watching performers her entire life, and she understood, technically and emotionally, exactly what she was looking at. She recognized the moment when an audience stops being an audience and becomes something else. A single organism, breathing in unison, completely in the hands of whoever is standing at that microphone. She had made that happen herself many times. She knew what it felt like from the stage, and she knew what it looked like from the side. She was watching it happen right now, and Marvin Gaye was barely moving. That was the part that got her, the stillness. She had always believed, still believed, honestly on some level, that you had to fight for a crowd. You had to attack the stage, command it, make your body as loud as your voice. That was what ownership looked like. That was the language she spoke. But Marvin wasn't speaking that language at all. He was doing something quieter and somehow more total. He was making the audience come to him, not by playing hard to get, not by technique or strategy, but by simply being so completely and honestly himself that the distance between him and the people watching collapsed on its own. Halfway through the second song, someone in the crowd started crying. Not sobbing, just the kind of quiet tears that happen when music reaches something you didn't know was there waiting to be reached. And then someone else. And then you could feel it moving through the room like a current. Tina didn't take her eyes off him. There was a particular moment, and people who were there that night would describe it differently depending on who you asked. But they all remembered a moment where the room reached a kind of absolute silence between phrases. Not the silence of people waiting, the silence of people who have forgotten they're in a theater, who have forgotten the seat under them and the person beside them, who are somewhere else entirely. Marvin held that silence for just a beat longer than anyone expected. And then he came back in, softer than before, and the room exhaled all at once. When Marvin finished and walked off stage, the applause was the kind that doesn't start all at once. It builds like people waking up from something and then realizing they need to respond. He passed Tina in the wings and she looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said a word, but the look was enough. There are moments in a career where you realize you've been operating with an incomplete definition of something you thought you understood completely. Tina Turner was not the kind of person who hid from those moments. She felt it and she let it land. She talked about that night years later in the careful way people talk about things that genuinely surprised them and changed something in how they understood their own craft. She said she'd never forgotten it, that she'd gone out there thinking about stage ownership in a completely different way after watching Marvin stand almost perfectly still and take an entire theater apart. That there was more than one way to make a room yours, that Marvin Gaye had found one she'd never considered. What happened in that theater in 1964 didn't make headlines. Nobody reviewed it. Nobody wrote a feature story about the night Marvin Gaye proved something to Tina Turner in an anonymous backstage hallway and then on a stage in front of a few hundred people somewhere in the middle of America. It was just a moment that happened and then receded into the past the way most moments do. But the people who were there carried it with them. The backing musicians talked about it for years. The stagehands who were watching from the sides. Tina herself. Because some nights leave a mark not because they were historic, but because they were true. Because something real happened. Something that cut through all the performance and calculation and strategy. And for a few minutes, a man just stood at a microphone and reminded an entire room what music was actually for. Marvin Gaye went on to spend another 2 decades complicating, reinventing, and ultimately breaking apart the very idea of what a soul singer could be and say and mean. The records he made after that night, What's Going On, Let's Get It On, I Want You, don't sound like the work of someone trying to prove anything to anyone. They sound like the work of someone who already knew exactly what he had and was figuring out, slowly and at great personal cost, how much of it to give away. But it started somewhere. And maybe it started in moments like that one, when someone told him he didn't have it, and he walked out on a stage and didn't argue, didn't posture, didn't perform confidence he didn't feel. He just opened up and let the thing inside him out. And it turned out the thing inside him was large enough to fill every room he'd ever stand in for the rest of his life. Have you ever had to fight a whole system just to show them your true soul? Tell us your story in the comments.